Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. And don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com, where you can find out about all the services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healing, as well as clairvoyant readings. And you can get all of these services done right from the comfort of your home. That is, unless you're in the Dallas area, where you can come into my office and meet me mano a mano. That's SoulHealer.com. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can learn to become a medical intuitive or energy healing practitioner. Oh, and I didn't mention this at the first hour, but start paying attention to the Soul Healer webpage, because in the next couple of weeks I will be announcing the release of my new book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, and I'll be doing some kind of pre-release order deal where you can get your book signed by the author, which is always priceless. Anyway, SoulHealer.com, check into it the next couple of weeks. It'll be on the Just Energy Radio website as well. Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, coming to a bookstore near you. Well, maybe not, but it'll be on Amazon. Anyway, let me get Nick back on the air, and we will continue our conversation about these secret places, because we're talking about his two books, Top Secret, The Pyramid and the Pentagon, as well as Keep Out, Top Secret Places Governments Don't Want You to Know About. Just too many secrets in our world today, Nick, I'm telling you.
Well, I think, the more our world sort of progresses, if that's the right word for it, there's more and more secrets come along. And unfortunately, it's the way of the world right now.
When we talk about antiquities, I think the first thing that comes to people's mind, especially with all the controversy around it, are the pyramids. Are there secret pyramid things going on that we don't know about? Is our government hiding pyramid info from us?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of basically the whole theme of the book, is that over the years, or decades, I should say, government agencies have secretly investigated a lot of ancient mysteries with a heavy focus on the pyramids of Egypt and elsewhere, other similar pyramid-type structures, for example, in Central and South America, because one of the things they addressed was the theory as to whether or not the pyramids were built with some sort of ancient equivalent of like anti-gravity or levitation. All these cultures around the world, whether it's Egypt, ancient Rome, Greece, Britain with Stonehenge, Central America, South America, Mexico, they all have stories about these stones, these massive multi-ton stones that were used to build these huge structures, supposedly being floated in the air into place rather than moved by, as science tells us, with ropes, pulleys, rollers, that sort of thing. And a number of files have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act demonstrating how the government took a great deal of interest in the work of authors who were writing books suggesting that the answer, or the secret answer, lay in levitation. And a lot of these files were shared with government or military, I should say, advanced weapon programs and projects. So it's clearly the military is trying to understand the nature of anti-gravity or levitation to try and develop it for themselves. And we're actually taking sort of a lead, if you like, or inspiration from these ancient stories of the pyramids, and trying to determine if sort of the ancients had developed a technology that we've lost, forgotten, or just sort of relegated to the world of folklore and mythology.
But the concept of levitation for the utilization of buildings doesn't just exist in Egypt. I know that, like in South America, in Peru, they talk about, the stones levitating. And I think there's some other places in the world that have the same story.
Yeah, actually, the same story actually surfaces from Stonehenge in England. One of the stories concerning that is that Merlin, the legendary magician who supposedly worked under King Arthur, that he was supposedly responsible for magically moving through the air the stones that went to make up Stonehenge. So we have a lot of stories like that, even from ancient Rome and Greece, about stones being lifted in the air to the sound. This sounds strange, but to the sounds of music and tunes. Now, nobody, of course, should take those sort of stories literally. But one of the things we find is that whether it's Britain with Stonehenge, the Egyptians, South America, Peru, Central America, Mexico, they all talk about the stones being lifted to the sound of tunes, to music, to musical instruments, and things like this. And basically what they're talking about is what's known today as acoustic technology, acoustic levitation. And it's sort of difficult to explain, but in simple terms, it's where you have two opposing sound frequencies with what are called interfering sound waves, kind of like when you try and push the opposites of a magnet together, and they push away. And this creates what's called a resonance zone, and you can actually use this resonance zone to lift objects up within it. That's what's called acoustic technology today. And the military has been researching this, and, granted they haven't lifted a 30-ton stone, but they have lifted small objects in these resonance zones using sort of what today is at least is sort of the beginnings and the fringes of acoustic levitation. So, in other words, using acoustics and sound waves to lift stones today, as the military is trying to do, actually isn't that different from somebody saying 2,000 years ago, that the ancients used music to lift the stones. My personal view is that these stories about music and musical instruments and tunes is a distortion of somebody in the distant past acquiring or developing this sort of acoustic levitation technology. Now, who did it, whether it was aliens, whether it was an advanced human culture that destroyed itself, we don't know. But it seems that it was employed and used widespread at one point, and then it and the people behind it just somehow vanished. Was it a worldwide flood? Was it some cataclysm, an ice age, who knows? But it was almost as if it was here one minute and gone the next. And today, most people just don't believe it. They write it off as myth. And I think, the military didn't. They took some of their inspiration from looking at these ancient stories.
But wasn't the guy that built the Coral Castle, didn't he supposedly, or the myth associated with that construction, modern construction, wasn't there talk about him using sound and some kind of levitation as well?
Yep. Yeah, the Coral Castle is a perfect example of like a latter-day example of this sort of technology being harnessed. And I think one of the things that the Coral Castle story tells us, if that really is how they were built, then this guy had basically stumbled on or developed or, added to or amplified on a very ancient technology that most of us don't understand. Now, the interesting thing is, with Coral Castle, there's all this talk about sound being used to lift the stones there, but there was no evidence of any sort of highly advanced machinery involved. So it seems to be the case, and this might explain why there's no evidence of the technology that built, these fantastic designs thousands of years ago. Maybe the technology is so alternative, it doesn't require the need of vast machines. Maybe it's sort of, a very different type of alternate energy, where if you can create these sound waves using, I'm speculating here, but a technology, that doesn't involve factories and huge machinery, if there's a way around that we don't understand, that might explain why somebody could do something like Coral Castle and not be actually seen doing it, because, there isn't some huge structure there that's making the stones lift. It's actually a very different type of science behind it, if you like. Maybe almost, like an ethereal science that doesn't involve machines in some respect. And there are also a lot of stories about how Tibetan monks could lift stones and objects, again, to like musical tunes and notes and things like that, played in a certain combination. But again, it must be some sort of like resonating zone on a vast scale. Not just somebody sitting cross-legged with a flute and the stone rises up. It's not that simple, but it's kind of that sort of scenario, if you like.
Mhm. Interesting. A friend of mine sent me this. Well, we were Facebooking back and forth, and she was telling me about this article that was in the New York Times yesterday about concerns about fighting in Syria. I thought this was interesting on a lot of different levels because of some of the ancient sites that are there. And then there was this 2 lines. I was like, it was 2 crappy lines about, and they were digging and they found this sculpture and a couple other things that were dating to 14,000 BC, so predating Göbekli Tepe. And so my mind immediately goes to, well, maybe there's some ancient technology there, and now the U.S. government wants to get a hold of it, which I've had people make the whole conspiracy theory, like that's why they want into the Middle East, is to access, I mean, they were saying Stargate technology, but some kind of ancient technology that has been lost there. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people talk about that. I mean, for example, when, the war on Iraq was at its height, one of the places that got looted was the Baghdad Museum, which contains literally thousands of sort of priceless artifacts, not just from Iraq, but surrounding nations as well, dating back literally thousands and thousands of years. And, of course, one of the most famous anomalies ever found is the so-called Baghdad Battery. If you Google Baghdad Battery, you'll see this sort of rudimentary battery-type device that was constructed literally thousands of years ago. People have suggested it was like a surviving relic of a far more ancient race that had passed down some of its secrets, and 1 or 2 of them have been remembered. But when the Baghdad Museum was looted, and an official study and audit was done, it came across that it actually didn't appear to be like random looting by, just people in the city quickly running in to grab something and sell it, at a pawn shop or whatever. But what they were actually talking about was a systematic looting of certain areas where it looked like the random sort of rioting and looting in the museum was a cover to allow certain players, we don't know who, to access specific areas where there were stories about ancient texts talking about, where certain secrets and ancient technologies could be found and where they were hidden. So, that's kind of a similar thing, that part of the reason, at least, for, having a foothold in the Middle East was to try and determine at least some of the truths behind these secrets of, antiquated technology, shall we say, or ancient technologies. And what better way to do that than, if you've got a foothold there, you can actually start looking for them under the guise and cover of doing something else.
One of my favorite shows on TV, because it kind of brings a whole bunch of different things together, was Stargate. They found this ring in the desert, and, you could take it, and it would create wormholes to other worlds. Now, that part was interesting, but the part that I loved the most about it was that the gods of, the entities, the personas that we perceived as gods in different geographical areas were these different, Gaul warlords. But then there are people that are saying, oh, well, there is a Stargate, or there was a Stargate in the Middle East. Have you heard anything about that? I mean, since we're kind of talking about that area?
Yeah, I have. I mean, that's actually a subject that's actually quite popular within sort of conspiracy theories, the idea that, there could be some sort of Stargate, like a real-life Stargate somewhere in the Middle East. Now, the origins of the story, if you like, go back to the so-called Anunnaki, which translates as those who came to Earth from heaven. And according to legend, sort of literally millennia ago, the Anunnaki arrived on Earth at Sumer, which is in the southern part of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which is actually today southern Iraq. And they were sort of perceived as being powerful gods by the people of Sumer, whose science and technology was supposedly helped transform, the local human population almost overnight. But I mean, some researchers have suggested the Anunnaki weren't gods. They were visiting extraterrestrials, and that they kind of like utilized stargates to travel massive distances. Rather than traveling in linear travel, from point A to point B, which would take a tremendous amount of time, that you bypass. Well, I don't say you bypass space and time, but you manipulate it and warp it. So incredible journeys in terms of time, etc., and length can be undertaken in seconds because you've literally warped time. And the story is that the Anunnaki built one of these stargates to allow them travel back and forth. And because they were supposedly in southern Iraq, this has given rise to that there's now a search on for the remains or the hidden complete example of one of these stargates somewhere underground in Iraq. So that's a theory that's sort of quite popular within conspiracy circles.
Wouldn't that be really cool? I mean, I've been asking for a transporter.
Well, it would be if we all had access to it, but I have a sneaking suspicion if the story is true, then, government agencies want to get hold of that technology for themselves and not for the rest of us poor folks.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. They're good at that.
Selfish. Well, I won't finish my sentence. But anyway, I think everybody knows where I'm
what
going.
it comes down to is a lot of this research isn't done to sort of further our knowledge of history, archaeology, etc. It's done when there's perceived as being some sort of military advantage. A Stargate would be a military advantage. Developing levitation and anti-gravity technology based around, how the pyramids might have been built is clearly being undertaken to see if that technology can be weaponized. It's not specifically being undertaken so we can learn more about the Egyptians. That's sort of two very different things.
Sad. All right, I don't mean to change topics because I want to come back to this topic, but I
don't
want
care. That's fine.
Ask, but there was a question that came up in the chat room, and I want to ask it before we get to the end and I forget. And this was Kathy Distant Echoes. And her question was, and I'm just going to kind of summarize it here, with you putting out all of this information about all these conspiracy theories and UFO information, have you ever felt like your life has been threatened?
No, because for the most part what I do, I use the Freedom of Information Act, and so I legally apply and obtain documents that the government has allowed us to see. I'm not somebody, and I never go down this path, nor do I endorse it at all, of doing things illegally. You only have to look at computer hackers, the trouble they get into, like Gary McKinnon, this well-known English computer hacker who went hacking for UFO data and now faces 75 years, in a U.S. jail and extradition. Well, that's what happens if you do it illegally and hack into government computers. It's not like they're going to sit there and say, oh, it's just him again. They're going to come down on you. I don't do that. I do it the legal way through, use the Freedom of Information Act. And so for that reason, I use in my books the material that the government has allowed us to see. And in some cases that can be snippets of material. On other occasions it can be quite a lot of material. So in that sense, it's kind of like I've never felt any sort of problem because, I'm not trying to leap the fences at military installations or anything like that. So.
Okay. Let's go back to where we were. So we're talking about these ancient places, ancient sites. Something that I was watching the other day on YouTube was about Noah's Ark and, them thinking they found Noah's Ark. Is there a big cover-up around that too?
Well, actually there is. I mean, this goes back to 1949, and this sort of covers the previous question as well, because I use the Freedom of Information Act. The book itself, Pyramids in the Pentagon, has 4 chapters on the Pentagon and the CIA's search for Noah's Ark. But all the material in those chapters is taken from government files, which I got through the Freedom of Information Act. And they show that back in 1949, a U.S. Air Force spy plane was flying across Turkey and near Mount Ararat, which is supposedly where, according to the Bible, Noah's Ark came to land. According to the story, according to the files, in 1949, in June, this spy plane was flying towards the border with the former Soviet Union because intelligence leads had determined that the Soviets were building a new military base somewhere near the border. And so what basically happened was that this spy plane ventured towards Mount Ararat. It was one of their sort of target points in terms of, where to look for this particular base. But as they got close to Mount Ararat, one of the guys on board the plane reported seeing what looked like a huge wing-like structure sticking out of the ice. And on top of that, one of the other guys on the other side of the plane could see a further huge wing-like structure. And so what happened was that they they didn't abort the original mission. What they did, they kind of phoned the headquarters and said, hey, we've found something strange on Mount Ararat, and can we get permission to film it? And so the guys all said, well, yeah, sure. So they got pictures of it, and it looked like 200-300 foot long wings. Now, of course, nobody was taking pictures. Nobody was taking pictures, of anything like that anywhere else in the world, because nobody was building, wings 300 feet long. And so this was clearly something strange. These photographs went back to the Pentagon, and from there, were duly classified. After that, what happened was that these pictures were shared with all various different people within the Pentagon and the CIA, and the government never officially said, they'd found by these photographs the remains of Noah's Ark. What they said, or unofficially, they refer to the thing in the photographs as what's called the Ararat anomaly. That's how it's officially termed within the Pentagon. Now, of course, it's like with the pyramids. The CIA and the military really have no vested interest in determining if there's an old ark, a wooden ark, on top of Mount Ararat. That's not their job. They're not archaeologists or historians or theologians. So why would they be interested and fascinated by this structure deeply buried in the ice for years, decades? This is where it gets into more controversial areas, because there were people in government who raised the question, well, what if it's not just an old wooden ark? What if aliens visited the Earth, thousands of years ago, and they knew there was a cataclysmic flood looming which was going to destroy much of the life on the Earth, and the planet would have to sort of start over again, and people would have to start over again? The theory that was suggested at official levels was, what if Noah's Ark was actually a space ark, and the aliens knew that this disaster was coming, and so what they did, they created these arks and filled them with not sort of 2x2 animals, as the legends suggest, but what if they had whole data banks of like human and animal DNA stored away in the event that the planet had to be repopulated again, because 70-80% of life had been destroyed. And from there, they speculated, what if one of these UFOs crashed on Mount Ararat, and the story of 2x2 animals and the Ark was an outgrowth of this sort of space ark preserving, all the various different DNA of everything on the planet, maybe even sort of fruit and vegetable seeds and things like that. So that was one of the reasons why it was so closely addressed, was it a crashed UFO? And of course, from there, the spin-off is, well, is there some technology we can develop or learn from it?
And I guess we just can't go running up there because it's not U.S. soil, so we can't just take it over.
Well, no, that's right. I mean, although Turkey is friends with the West, it's not like they're an enemy, they're part of NATO. But even the Turkish government today, they're very reticent about having everybody and his brother running around the mountain. So that's why the U.S. Was forced to sort of use spy satellites and spy planes to overfly the area. And I actually reproduced one of the photographs in the book of this so-called Ararat anomaly, and it does look like a man-made structure sticking out of the ice. It's not like people think because it's Turkey. They think it's all desert and scalding hot weather. It's not. The top of Mount Ararat is sort of permanently frozen and windswept and covered in snow. It's like being at the top of the Himalayas almost.
There was one gentleman, and I thought I had his name written down, but I just have a little sticky note on my desk for somebody that I wanted to have come on the show that says, Noah's Ark, show guest. It's like, okay, not that paper. But I mean, there's YouTube about this guy who actually went up there and did like ground penetrating radar, and he felt like there was actually something up there, but getting permission to do any kind of digging just has not been forthcoming.
No, I mean, there have been a lot of expeditions. They don't mind people going up there, but when you start to want to talk about hauling off a potentially 600-foot-long object and coming in with hundreds of people and tearing up the landscape, I think they prefer to kind of see it as like a home to a legend, if you like. It's their Mount Ararat's claim to fame. If it wasn't for the Noah's Ark story, it would be just another mountain. And I think that possibly has something to do with it. The idea that this is something that goes far beyond just a mountain, and it goes far beyond just an old wooden boat, because, these spy photographs were taken in 1949. Well, the latest entry that I got through the Freedom of Information Act was 1995. That's almost 50 years of collecting data. And what's interesting, the CIA files even talk about how they dispatched agents to sort of clandestinely go out in, just jeans and T-shirt and sit in the audience at lectures where people were talking about their books on Noah's Ark. That shows the sheer level of interest, that it wasn't just sitting in the office and looking at a few photographs and thinking, oh, what's that? They were traveling around the United States, listening intently when anybody had a new book out and, what their theories were on Noah's Ark, and then carefully making notes at the back of the room and presenting and preparing, official files on all the latest developments. So there was clearly an ongoing, at least half a century study, which, because the files go as late as 95, I don't see any reason why the investigation shouldn't still be going on. It's just that those files haven't yet surfaced.
If it's a UFO up there, I guess I can understand why there would be government interest. But if it's just an old boat, okay, granted, Noah's Ark, you know what I mean? So it does have some prestige going on. But I can't, my brain cannot fathom why the government would have any interest in that.
Well, that's the important thing, Rita. They wouldn't. If Noah's Ark was found and it was proven to be a real old ark, and they found inside it, a bunch of skeletons of animals, that's sort of vindication of the story. There's no way around that. But that would be something major for archaeologists, historians, and theologians. It wouldn't be something that would have the Pentagon, running around doing handstands or whatever. It just wouldn't, because it's not part of their mandate to investigate, who built Stonehenge or whatever. It just doesn't, unless there's something going on that suggests the original legend or story isn't the complete story, and that it does involve something different. That's when they would get involved. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean with Mount Ararat and this Ararat anomaly that the government has all the answers. I actually don't think they do. But I think they have a lot of evidence that something weird is up there, but they're kind of frustrated by the fact that not only, does the Turkish government not want sort of large-scale digging way up the top of the mountain, but even if they did, the operation would be extraordinarily difficult. We're not talking about pulling out something the size of a canoe. You're talking about objects possibly 600 feet long, buried in ice, buried in snow, right at the top of a mountain. That would be an extremely difficult project, to try and salvage that in one piece, or even salvage it secretly. It just couldn't be done, without everybody knowing about it. So.
Well, and I think, from Turkey's position, it's better to have the maybe Noah's Ark up there as opposed to, Fred's cruiser that somehow got up there. It's kind of like the pyramid in China of the first emperor, and how the Chinese government will not let anybody go in there and excavate.
Yeah, another classic example is Loch Ness in Scotland. The Scottish Tourist Board love the Loch Ness Monster, not because they know what it is. They love it because it's a mystery, and mysteries engage and enthuse people, and they bring the tourists in. And so any area of the world that, has like a dollar bill angle to it where people flock to it. It's like the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're on public display. Millions of people go and see those. It's kind of like, when the Egyptian mummy displays, are brought over to the US. Tens and thousands of people go and see them, line up and pay good money to see, this petrified mummy, if you like, in bandages and this gold-ornated coffin up, etc. So in other words, even if you take conspiracies out of the angle, there is a vested reason why a lot of countries around the world don't want their mysteries and their archaeological legends, etc., touched for economic reasons, if nothing else.
Well, and I've heard rumors about the Dead Sea Scrolls that, what has been released to the public is just this tiny little part of all of the scrolls that they actually have. And I don't know if it's because they haven't been translated, so they haven't been released or filmed, or, what the deal is around them, but it just seems like even with those, which are can be potentially so historic in nature, just from the written documentation, that they would really kind of drag their heels on it so much.
Yeah, I actually have 2 chapters in the Pyramids of the Pentagon on the Dead Sea Scrolls, because a number of years ago now, a man named Miles Copeland, who was a senior operative in the CIA, he was actually also the father of Stuart Copeland, who was the drummer with the Police, of all things. But Miles Copeland was a senior operative within the CIA, and in 1947, when the year in which the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, he was actually working at the CIA station in Damascus, the capital of Syria. And one of these scrolls, actually one that's never been seen since after 47, it never made its way to the official collection, was brought into his office by a resident of the city who we don't know, a sort of mysterious character, who said he wanted this scroll deciphering. And, Copeland said, well, it's not really our job, but, I do know someone who is an expert in ancient languages. This was a man named Kermit Roosevelt, and he was also a man with heavy ties to the CIA. So Copeland agreed to have it sent to the CIA for analysis, and supposedly it had to do with ancient prophecies, strange dreams, and much to do with the Book of Daniel and future events and things like this. And reportedly, it got the CIA concerned because it supposedly forecasted things that were going to happen in the future. That scroll was never handed back, in terms of being put on public display anywhere, and it's never since surfaced out of the archives or the vaults of the CIA. And but Miles Copeland went on record and, quite vocally saying, I saw this scroll, I photographed it, and the material evidence and the pictures I sent away for analysis, and, I got these rumors back and heard what was going on with it, but that was the last I saw of it, and unfortunately, outside of the CIA, it was the last that anybody saw of it. So, again, the thing is, why would the CIA classify and hide a Dead Sea Scroll? It's an old scroll telling, an early religious, biblical history, unless it talks about something that has sort of an espionage or a technology angle to it. Now, one of the things I talk about, which is admitted speculation, the very fact that, this scroll reportedly talks about future prophecies and almost like psychic powers, this is an area that the CIA has dabbled in, or not dabbled, but delved into deeply. Things like remote viewing, psychic spying. So we know they've had an interest in those sort of areas. So it would make sense that if they found out that was being done in the past, maybe they used that as sort of like leverage to try and understand how it worked and why it worked.
But see, that story, no offense, kind of doesn't make sense, because if the guy took it to the other guy for him to translate, then he wouldn't really know what was in it. Unless maybe he had some inkling of what was in it in the first place.
Well, yeah, whoever this mysterious character was that brought the scroll to Copeland, we don't know, but, we could speculate it was somebody who found one of these scrolls, maybe realizing he got something important and didn't want to be accused of stealing it or finding it and not handing it over. So, he gave it to somebody else, i.e. Copeland, to let him have the responsibility. But as I said, Copeland admitted himself he couldn't speak any, whatever this language was. It was written in a very ancient and archaic language. So he handed it over to Kermit Roosevelt, this expert in ancient Middle Eastern languages. And from there, it supposedly went to various code breakers and language experts in the CIA and people who they consulted. And that's when, the story came out as to what it contained. I'm guessing that until the rumors got back to Copeland, it was just another day's work for him, not something to give too much thought about until, all these weird tales started surfacing as well.
That's just so amazing.
Yeah.
Just so amazing.
Yeah, the good thing is, of course, it sounds a strange and bizarre story, but, it's not like it's coming from some Mr. X. Miles Copeland, was a verifiable, decorated senior officer, within the CIA. He was the station officer at Damascus in Syria, so he was a very reputable, skilled person, and went on record saying, I handled this, I unrolled it, I photographed it, and, he saw it. So.
But his pictures, I'm sure, mysteriously disappeared.
Yes, they did, unfortunately. And although some of the pictures of Noah's Ark, as I said, I've reproduced one of them, or this Ararat anomaly in the book, the Dead Sea Scroll pictures, these specific ones at least, that went to the CIA, those pictures have never ever surfaced. We just don't even the CIA doesn't actually acknowledge they exist. So that, is, in itself is sort of pretty extraordinary.
And so everyone listening, that's one good thing about digital, because you can email them to your friends and have copies everywhere just in case.
Yeah, you don't have to go into the dark room anymore. So.
Well, and then there's just not the issue of the negatives,
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Well, speaking of ancient technologies, what we've talked about so far, okay, there's a UFO in Ararat, or, some ancient prophecy on a Dead Sea Scroll. But when I think things that the government are going to want to take or going to want to have access to, I'm thinking about, we talked a little bit about the levitation, but what about some of the stuff that you hear in Indian tradition, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, where they're flying around and they got these weapons with laser beams and shooting each other and blowing each other up. Now, that I can understand the government wanting some juice about.
Yeah, well, I think they basically cover all bases. But this for me is one of certainly the most profound of all stories as it relates to the ancient past. And for me, it's almost a clincher that there were civilizations highly advanced, in some cases as advanced or maybe more advanced than ours. Where I differ with a lot of researchers who believe that, I'm not so sure that there was a huge worldwide situation, 50, 60,000 years ago like we have today. I think it's more likely, if that was the case, we'd see far more evidence of it. Even if there was a massive destruction, we would still see it everywhere. I think what probably happened was that there were localized, highly advanced civilizations in certain areas, such as the Middle East, South America, Central America, Egypt, Mexico, etc., but not, sort of mainland Europe, Russia, Canada, United States, Australia as they were then. A lot of these stories about advanced technologies come from the Middle East and South America and India and those sorts of places. So I think it was more localized than, a worldwide civilization. But to get back to the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they're basically two very ancient Sanskrit texts that chronicle the tales of a vastly old nation, people, history, and its wars, and specifically what's called the Kurukshetra War, which occurred in a northern India state called Haryana. Now, as for when this occurred, some of the most conservative estimates suggest 8,000 years ago, which is a long time ago. Others suggest that the documents are actually, or the texts are based on even older documents. Some people have suggested like 20 or 30,000 years ago, which would be, if true, that would be like an incredible revision of, all that we know about history, but it's not by any means, I don't think, impossible. Now,
so are we talking the Ramayana or the Mahabharata?
The Mahabharata, sorry.
Okay.
But with the Mahabharata, you would imagine if you're talking about an ancient war in India between two localized factions, your imagery would go through your mind of like chariots and horses and spears and bows and arrows and sort of lances, that kind of thing. The Mahabharata doesn't talk about anything like that at all. It talks about these aircraft known as vimanas, and in the translated editions from the text into English, the vimanas are basically, they sound almost like Top Gun aircraft powered by mercury. That's how they're described. And they can sort of zip around the skies at incredible speeds. And they basically had this sort of artillery on board, weaponry on board, which were described as like iron rods that would be let loose from the vimanas by their pilots. These were manned aircraft as well, by their pilots. And as they would sort of hit the cities, there would be this vast, massive explosion. The ground would shake for miles. There'd be this huge plume of smoke and brilliant flash in the sky. There'd be like a 3 or 4 mile high plume of smoke that would sort of envelop and just hang ominously over the landscape. The sky would go black because so much dirt was kicked up. The temperature would drop because the sun couldn't get through. And in the immediate hours and days afterwards, all the soldiers and people in the area would start to fall ill and die. Now, that's not me just saying that. That's literally how the Mahabharata words it. Now, if you think of that today, a high-flying aircraft firing off a device that, makes the ground shake, and you have a multi-mile high tower of smoke, just looming over, and you have this incredible flash. You have people dying, not from the blast, but falling sick in the hours and days afterwards. That is like a description of, an atomic bomb, an atomic explosion, the mushroom cloud, the brilliant flash, and radiation poisoning, which does kick in, as the radiation starts to come down and infects the human, well, not infects, but basically, destroys bodily cells, etc. And, you die a horrible death very quickly. And even, when they talk about the sky going black and the temperature dropping, that fits in with what scientists today have suggested would happen in a nuclear war. That so many, literally billions of tons of dirt and dust would be thrown up into the atmosphere, it would block the sun for so long that the temperature would drop, crops would die, animals would die. We would see a substantial drop. Me and you are both in Texas. You imagine 107 degrees going down to, say, 37 degrees for the next 6 years without change. That's the scenario. And, when you read the Mahabharata, it's difficult to realize, or amazing to realize, this was written thousands of years ago, but it sounds like, our worst nightmare today of like a third world war. Now, what's even more intriguing is that one person who was fascinated and obsessed by both the Ramayana, which tells similar stories as well, and the Mahabharata, was Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, the father behind the atomic bomb. Now, Oppenheimer wasn't just obsessed by the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. He would quote them all the time, and he actually came to regret developing the atomic bomb when he saw, granted it did finish the Second World War, and it prevented the hostilities going on any longer, but even though he was the brains behind it, he was shocked by the sort of sheer scale of devastation, because a lot of people don't realize that although when the atomic bomb was first developed in the 40s, until the first one was tested in New Mexico just before the two were dropped on Japan, nobody really knew fully what was going to happen when they detonated the bomb. There was even talk it was going to destroy the Earth, but unfortunately it didn't. But, so the first one was basically a case of pushing the button and let's see what happens. But then, they used the 200 pound, the war came to an end. And Oppenheimer, as a result and afterwards, constantly sort of pored over the pages of the Mahabharata, wondering, if this had all happened once before. And as evidence of this, in 1952, he was part of a seminar in Washington, D.C., and somebody asked him, are the three atomic bombs, the first three atomic bombs, the test one in New Mexico and then the two dropped on Japan, were they the first ones ever used? And Oppenheimer replied, yes, they were. And then he paused for a moment and then added, in modern times, as if to say, well, they're the first time our civilization has used them. But it was almost like he was giving a little clue to the fact that maybe somebody else had developed them long before. And, of course, at the time, Oppenheimer was involved, in the 40s, with arguably the most secret government program of all. So if the government did know or suspected there were civilizations somewhat like ours who came before us, but, vastly many thousands of years before, Oppenheimer would have probably been one of the people who was in the know.
But, weren't the Nazis really into looking for and collecting artifacts for whatever purpose?
Oh, yeah, the Nazis
also
were, they were involved, long before the U.S. At the height of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler was on a search for all sorts of mystical relics and ancient artifacts. In a fictional format, of course, this is most famously told in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones film, where the Nazis are on the hunt for the Ark of the Covenant, which supposedly, could flatten cities and part waters and kill people. But it is true that Hitler was on a secret hunt. He had an entire wing, if you like, of the SS that went looking all around the world, to South America, Mexico, on the hunt for mystical relics that Hitler and the Nazis believed possessed supernatural powers that they could then use against against the Allies. And that was literally the idea that Hitler had in mind, sort of use the power of God and weaponize it, against the West. And it sounds bizarre, but Hitler was bizarre. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and we won the war. But for a few years, until Hitler realized that he had to sort of just focus on surviving. Unfortunately, he didn't survive. But for a long time, there was this entire wing that would be funded, to travel here, there, and everywhere, trying to get its hands on everything from the Ark of the Covenant to the Spear of Destiny, to all sorts of biblical relics that Hitler thought, if this one has this power and this one has that power, we won't have to be reliant on bombers or battleships. We can just zap them or whatever.
Well, that would
Literally.
be good.
Well, not for us, but I guess it would be for him. But fortunately, it didn't come to pass.
Yeah, we'd all be running around with those little mustaches on, or
we'd
something.
all be goose stepping by now or whatever. So.
Yeah.
Like the little Nazis.
One last topic that you did talk about in your book, and of course it's, like the very last question on the other piece of paper, and I'm like, wait. Because one of the things we talked about were pyramids, but then there's the whole, out of this world concept of pyramids, namely those on Mars, or even, the whole concept of bases on the moon. But I'd like to talk about Mars because... I don't know. I think there was something there.
Well, yeah, Mars, is an area that actually a lot of people who discuss the whole ancient astronaut scenario on Earth are very intrigued by what we've found on Mars. For example, in 1976, when NASA's Viking probe took photographs of an area of Mars called Cydonia, they photographed this strange face-like structure that looks, eerily like the Egyptian Sphinx. But whereas the Egyptian Sphinx, points outwards, the face on Mars points upwards. Now, NASA doesn't avoid speaking about the face on Mars, but they say, it's just like people seeing faces in clouds or whatever, that sort of thing, or somebody seeing the face of Jesus in a cheeseburger, that things like that. And so they just write it off, officially at least. They write it off as that. But what's interesting is that in this same area of Cydonia, where you have this, what looks like a huge carved face, you also have a number of very pyramid-like structures. And you can find pictures of these on the internet. They're legitimate NASA photos, but NASA again says, it's just how the Martian wind blows and, it sculpts things at an angle, etc. But they look for all the world as if somebody had flown over Egypt with a high-flying plane and took a few photographs, blurry, but that's how they look. And so because we have in Egypt the Sphinx and the pyramids, and on this particular part of Cydonia we have what looks like a Sphinx and pyramids, this has inevitably given rise to the theory, could there be some ancient connection between Mars and Egypt? Is it possible that the Egyptian gods who came down and suddenly elevated the Egyptians, from a fairly primitive state to people who could build multi-level pyramids made out of stones weighing multi-tons? Is it possible they weren't gods? Could they have been some elements of like a Martian civilization that either visited the Earth or possibly, if Mars began to degrade in terms of its atmosphere, actually fled Mars and settled here and wanted to leave some legacy of their technology and their culture and history, and prompted and encouraged the primitive people to, develop and build pyramids, as some legacy of the Martians' original world. That's what we would do. If our planet faced destruction and some people could leave and go somewhere else, we would want to be able to start over in a human fashion, and try and build something that was a memorial to what was lost on the original world. So, this has sort of given rise to this theory that maybe the Egyptian gods were sort of visiting Martians. Now, it sounds controversial, but if you look at a lot of the pictures on Mars, we see evidence of some very strange structures, even outside of Cydonia, like what look like monuments, pyramids elsewhere on the planet. And if you Google banyan tree, B-A-N-Y-A-N, you'll find photographs taken by NASA again, which they say have down-to-earth explanations, but that look like trees and bushes. And it's difficult to avoid thinking that's exactly what they are. And they look like somebody's flying over, I know, Arizona, 300 feet with a black and white camera and photographed a bunch of trees in the desert. That's what they look like. They're that clear. So I don't think Mars is the totally dead planet that a lot of people assume or perceive it to be. And, there are even theories, could there be like an existing Martian civilization that's gone deep underground, when the atmosphere degraded and the oceans vanished? Mars does have a significant water supply frozen at the poles. It wouldn't be out of the question for an advanced technology to use that surviving water, and recirculate it and survive and thrive possibly underground. So I don't think we can rule out the possibility that Mars still harbors life, nor can we rule out that the whole face on Mars pyramids thing is interconnected somehow with what's going on, or what did go on, I should say, in Egypt.
Don't you think it's interesting with the Mars rovers that they have sent up there, that they've gone anywhere but Cydonia?
Well, yeah, it's one of these things where the official story is that we're not going to waste our time photographing a bit of rock that is just a rock. We want to go where there's more interesting stuff. But, in saying that, the thing
we're
is, of course,
interested. Wait,
let's
take a vote. We're interested.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think if Nick and Rita sort of turn up outside NASA and say, we demand you photograph Cydonia, it's going to have much of an effect, you know what I mean? So,
well, we could take a poll.
Well, that's true.
I think it would be more than me and you.
Well, it would. Not to sort of look on the negative side. The interesting thing is that the reason we know the face on Mars exists and these pyramids exist is because NASA's released the photographs. In other words, NASA isn't hiding the photographs. It's saying, we think there's just natural reasons why these things exist. So in other words, if there was a worldwide civilization, potentially, if we had a really close look at some of these photographs that NASA just shovels out into the public domain, we might see stuff elsewhere on Mars if it was a worldwide civilization. Because, and maybe NASA missed something when they originally looked at the pictures, and, somebody else will just stumble upon it. So I don't think, even though, there aren't plans to sort of go back to Cydonia again, I don't think that rules out that we might not find some more interesting stuff on these, thousands of pictures that we've already got.
Well, we have 2 minutes. Bases on the moon, no bases on the moon.
Well,
what do you think?
Well, people have talked about bases on the moon. For years there are rumors about NASA photographs of bases on the far side of the moon. One of the interesting things I found doing research is, there were people in government who remote viewed the moon and came across evidence possibly that there was some sort of alien installation below the surface of the moon. But equally, back in the early 1960s and late 50s, the U.S. Army had a secret program called Project Horizon, which was a plan to build like a secret clandestine base on the moon and militarize the moon, where it would be staffed. It would be sort of stocked with nuclear weapons. In the event of a war with the Soviets, if America got taken out, at least America could still unleash its nuclear missiles from the moon down at Russia. That was the idea. So, when we look at military stories and documents, which have now again surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act on Project Horizon, when we've got military plans to build bases on the moon, and we've got the government remote viewing the moon and potentially coming up with alien stuff, you have to begin to wonder, is the moon sort of like a hotbed on the far side for all sorts of weird activity?
Do you think, I'm looking at the clock, okay, do you think that the base is there? Because there's speculation, I've heard it on both ways, that they're current bases, but then there is the conversation that these are just ancient facilities that are there. Do you think there are like people living there now?
Well, it's difficult to say, Rita, because, if you look at Mars, there's no doubt that Mars is a very harsh, destroyed world. Its atmosphere...
No, the moon.
No, I know, but what I was going to say is parallel. The reason why the Martian structures look so badly damaged is because of the harsh environment and the atmosphere. On the moon, there is no atmosphere. So in other words, there's no sort of atmospheric pollution or anything like that. So even very ancient structures could last a long time. That's why the lunar landers that the Apollo astronauts landed in. That's why they're in such a good condition, because there's no atmosphere. So in other words, even if we photograph bases on the moon, they could be extremely old, but the fact that it's, that there's no atmosphere, that it's a vacuum, it would be difficult to know if they were built last week or, 10 centuries ago or however long. So, but, if they're suitably maintained and it was a highly advanced alien technology, conceivably they could be up and running for forever,
That would be cool.
Yes, it would.
Now, let's see. So we need just so many answers we need. I wish somebody could, go in there, get the secret file, tell everybody.
Yeah. Well,
it
I
would
think
be good.
sometimes, I think the government's hiding a lot when it comes to UFOs. With these ancient mysteries, even with the government's power and, ability to ferret out this and that, I think they're stuck up to a degree because these mysteries are so old,
Yeah. Nick, you need to go. Thanks again for coming on the show. And I'm sure you'll be back soon, because I'm sure you have another book that's coming out next week or something. Yes, you do. All right, bye, Nick.
Thanks, Rita. See you later. Bye-bye.
That's Nick Redfern. His website is nickredfern.com. His books, Top Secret, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, as well as Keep Out, Top Secret Places the Government Doesn't Want You to Know About. Next week, we're going to be speaking to Rabbi Wayne Dosick about the real names of God and also indigo children. And so until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. Thank you all for tuning into the show, and be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita. Until next time, remember,